Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transportation. Uh, I wasn't sure what to talk about today, so I did a quick poll on Twitch, not on Twitch, sorry, on Discord, on on Mastodon slash Fedi, on Blue Sky, and on Twitter, and the overall result was a landslide for talking about the issue of light versus heavy rail in the United States. This is a distinction that historically mattered quite a lot, historically being 70s and 80s, and yes, this will lead toward IBX. In fact, I came up with this idea while discussing the situation with a journalist who was asking me some questions about certain aspects of the IBX plan in New York. But it's not going to be predominantly about the Interboro Express. It's something that I think is broader. It's actually a recommendation that I've been asked to make. So this is like something that, due to how American federal bureaucracy works, this distinction between light and heavy rail still looms large in American transit planning, even though in America today it barely matters. So, it's actually a really interesting example of a kind of rather bullshit distinction, but it's a bullshit distinction that, again, used to matter. It no longer does, but it's been kept institutionally. So this might be interesting as an example of an institutional failure, in that something that ceases to be important is still treated as a really big decision due to certain elements of bureaucracy. So I'm going to do this. So I'm going to actually talk about this chronologically. So if you're expecting me to rag on the Interboro Express, hang on, because the Interboro Express is a project from really the last, I don't know, maybe 2 years, as far as I remember, in its current iteration, whereas we're talking about history that goes back to the 1970s. Now, so chronologically, what happens is in the United States, let's not have this crayon on. In the United States, in the early 20th century, sometimes even, in one case even in the very end of the 19th, the biggest cities start implementing rapid transit, electric rapid transit. This is, by definition, grade separated. Reason being, in the 1890s, there are no cars. I mean, yes, there are cars, but the first gas station in America opened 1901. The Model T was only 1908. In 1900, there was maybe one vehicle per 1,000 people in the United States, but there was extensive traffic congestion of horse cars and streetcars. Not even just 1900, in the 1850s, there was such extensive congestion of horse-pulled carriages in London that is why they built the London Underground. There was there was a lot of traffic congestion for travelers who wanted to get between the train stations, none of which was right in the center of London, especially not going from points north and west, where most of the United Kingdom is. London is in the southeast of the country, which means that the vast majority of intercity travelers would come from here and not from here, from point south and east, and even some of that northeast. The train stations actually had rather good penetration because the people living east and south of the historic city of London were poor, so the property values were lower, and it was easier to buy property. So this is why there's Fenchurch Street right here, and Liverpool Street, and London Bridge right across the bridge. But from points north and west, it was farther away, the historic center being here. So there were carriages here, and there was such congestion that they built the underground. This was in the 1860s that it opened. So based on congestion for horse cars and electric streetcars in the 1890s, they started building subways in America. This is only in the largest cities. So Boston builds the first underground line, the Green Line, which is currently part of the Green Line, I believe 1898, but I may be off by a year. New York opens the subway 1904. Philadelphia starts by building something like the Boston Green Line, so a subway surface tunnel, but that's part of a four-track line. Two tracks are subway surface, two tracks are the Market Frankfurt line. I believe that's 1906 or 1907. Chicago, it's hard to say because in Chicago they started running. Chicago famously has the L. It goes elevated. The electrification there is from 1898, I believe. That's when they electrified the loop. The modern electric multiple units was the modern electric multiple unit. That is to say, self-propelled cars, but with control of all of the cars from the lead car. That was invented for the Chicago L, and that network kept accruing more lines with just one city center loop. They only built the subways, so the red line subway, the State Street subway, and then the blue line, the what's it called? Is it called the Dearborn, you think, or Milwaukee Dearborn Congress or something like that? That is 1940s. But anyways, this is early 20th century, the early rapid transit lines. And again, in the beginning, it's just four cities: Boston, New York, Philly, and Chicago, the four largest cities in America. Let's now skip 60 years or so forward. It's the 1950s, 60s. There is extensive car-oriented suburbanization in the United States, and it's understood that solutions are needed to traffic congestion. At this point, it's not horse cars. At this point, it's cars. There have been traffic jams of cars in the United States going back to the 1920s. The mentality that is currently mocked among urbanists, but at the time was still current, was one more lane will fix it. Or rather, the idea was that a road through a city gets congested, so you build a bypass. The bypass then gets congested because there's more traffic. Businesses locate on the bypass because they want to serve travelers passing through, which comes at the expense of the historic city center. And that suddenly becomes the new drag, the new road, especially for a smaller city. And then that itself gets bypassed, and again, the situation where the bypass induces more traffic and gets congested with local and through traffic keeps going on. The road czars understand that they need to, they want to build more roads. They want to complete the interstate system, which they had been pushing for since the late 30s, start the 40s. They got the money in the 50s. So they built the interstates in the late 50s and in the 60s and so on. But they know that they need more. So the road czars mostly back buses because they prefer things that go on roads, but there's a lot of understanding that there needs to be something that's more than just buses, and against the opinions of the road czars who just want, again, cars, maybe buses, there's investment in urban rail. Hello. So the urban rail that is being built is a bunch of subway systems with much more federal aid than before. There was no federal aid for the subway in New York. Maybe there was some for the IND in the Depression, I'm not sure, but certainly there wasn't for the first subway or for the dual contracts. So much more. So this is, again, it's the 1960s. It's a much bigger government mood than the 1900s, 10s, 20s. The federal government will pay if the region agrees to it. Often this involves referendums, and in LA, for example, the referendum fails. LA chooses not to build a subway system in the 60s, but other cities do. And these are called the Great Society subways. Usually when people talk about the Great Society subway in the singular, they mean the largest of the three by ridership, which is the Washington Metro. But this can also equally include BART. I believe BART, in fact, opened a few years before the Washington Metro, and MARTA. I forget whether the Miami Metro Rail, which is elevated owing to the fact that it is Florida, the water table is so high, houses don't even have basements. You're not building a subway in Florida. You are, however, building elevated trains, that's okay. The Metro Rail in Miami is the one that's, I think, the most mocked, just because it's the by far weakest. Miami has the weakest business center of these cities. That's the one where the analysis of taking the cost per rider, the construction cost per weekday trip, and then comparing it to the cost of buying a car originates from. That was, I don't know who came up with that idea, but Ronald Reagan used it to attack government funding for mass transit by pointing to the weakest such example. Miami, we're not going to talk about Miami because, again, it's kind of, it's so weak, people don't really talk about it as like a thing that should be expanded. MARTA, by the way, is very weak, even by American standards, but more people use it, and there is a sentiment that there should be more investment in it. In MARTA's case, also a lot of racism involved, just because it's, again, 1960s, 70s, lots of white flight. Now, Atlanta did call itself the city that's too busy to hate in the 60s. It genuinely had a lot less racist violence than, for example, Birmingham. Birmingham and Atlanta, I think, were the two main industrial cities of the first half of 20th century South. Atlanta was much bigger, but Birmingham at one point was maybe half the size of Atlanta. I mean, Metro Birmingham maybe was half the size of Metro Atlanta, and at this point, I think the population ratio between them is something like a factor of 6. And Birmingham did lose a lot of crowd over Bull Connor. So there is something to the fact that Atlanta genuinely was less racist and has, and today, for example, it's a very important African American cultural center. However, all of this is relative, and this was in the context of extensive white flight, where the white suburban counties refused to support MARTA because they did not want trains to make it easier for what they perceived as poor black people to have access to them. And as I understand it, the state of Georgia doesn't support MARTA at all. So I think MARTA might actually be the only subway in America that does not get any state support. But again, people use MARTA. It's like not a lot of people, but it is a thing. But mainly when people talk about the Great Society subways, they would talk about DC, maybe also BART, but mainly DC. So let's talk about these for a sec. So I'm talking about 3, and again, by far biggest in ridership, similar extent, less ridership, much smaller. So I don't have good maps for them, so I'm gonna look for, so instead I'm gonna try to show you an Alexander Rapp's map. Timelines, would DC be Wash? Or DCA maybe? Okay, I don't wanna wait. Washington is WAS, okay. So these are all on the same scale, so when this loads, you will be able to see that this is a system with extensive reach outward. Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is, so, I mean, often, it's something that often, like, the stereotypes that are here in the northern US need to be nuanced a lot, because, again, Atlanta is genuinely a very strong African-American cultural center. But no, I mean, the state of Georgia hates Atlanta. Okay, so this is DC, the DC metro. This is a metro area of, I don't know how many I would count, because the combined statistical area includes Baltimore, and you don't want to talk about Baltimore about when it's pure Washington, so maybe, I don't know, 5-6 million people. So yeah, there are 3 trunk lines. Red, it's the one that doesn't share tracks with anything else. Green, yellow, and then orange, blue, silver. 3 trunk lines. There's extensive interlining and reverse branching. This is inherited from, they got the idea from New York. It's kind of unusual that they do it on such a small system. This, with the addition of the silver line, so instead of 2, and historically there have been 2, so when this opened, which was very recently, instead of 2, it became 3-way, and this mucked the rest of the track sharing system. But but the point is, not a lot of lines, but they do reach very far out, because this was designed in the 60s and built in the 70s and 80s and 90s for post-war level of suburbanization. To put things in perspective, if we do New York City, the horizontal extent of this map is less. This is a metro area that has about 3 or 4 times the size of Washington. Combined area is barely a factor of 2 at this point, but again, we're not talking combined because combined means including Baltimore and DC, and we shouldn't, so it's probably a factor of 3. New York has extensive suburban sprawl. Yes, there's a lot of density here, but there's also suburban sprawl that hops not just the line into Jersey here, but into Pennsylvania. I mean, there are people, there's significant commuting. If you use a Japanese definition of metro area, which is 1.5% of the aged 15 or above population commute to the central city, then the Poconos, so Pike and Monroe counties, should count as suburbs of New York City. The box ends about here. Because this was designed mostly in the early 20th century just for the city. For the suburbs there was commuter rail, and there wasn't a lot of population in the suburbs. By the time there was extensive suburbanization, they developed something different. DC instead designed a combined system for the use of the city and the suburbs. There was no long history of strong commuter rail ridership in Washington, unlike in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, or Boston. And as a result, this is something that I call a suburban metro. A suburban metro is something that's designed, again, with extensive reach to the point that this is what you should think of as a suburban metro. San Francisco is another really good example. Now, San Francisco did have a strong historic commuter line, but it only went from San Francisco to San Jose. It's Caltrain today. And indeed, there wasn't much BART there. There were maybe plans to take over back when people thought in the 1960s again that rail was obsolete, that normal trains were obsolete. Here too, you can see the horizontal extent is huge, and there's literally one trunk line through San Francisco. The map doesn't show it clearly. There's a second trunk line, which uses the same Market Street subway. It is okay, it's just because it was closed. Okay, it's easier to see now when we look at it a year when it actually ran. This is Unimetro. It was built around the same time. So technically 2 trunk lines, but they're on the same street. So here, unlike in Washington, the emphasis was much more about the suburbs, and the professor and a transit advocate and consultant, Christoph Spieler, this is how he spells his name, first came to my attention for a blog post in 2005, I think, or 2006, comparing the two, explaining how, no I don't, that wasn't my location, how the DC Metro at the time had 3 times the ridership of BART. At this point it's more like 1.5 or 2x, just because, okay, maybe 2019 I should say, it's about 1.5 to 2x. San Francisco got a much larger hit on public transit than other American cities due to Corona. So this is up to the 1970s, so these were built. Again, maybe not the full extent we're seeing, because, for example, the SFO extension is an idea from the 90s, so this is more like the system as it was intended. But still, extensive suburban reach, park and rides, sometimes transit-oriented development along specific corridors or near specific stations, but sadly not very much of it. Practically none in the Bay Area, some in DC around Arlington. Much better examples of suburban metro are not American. I don't want people to think that the suburban metro model is purely American. Absolutely is not. Stockholm is actually a pretty good one, because of it was built when Stockholm was starting to build to build extensive public housing. There were some early examples, and then after them there was the much better known National Million program, where they built 1 million housing units Sweden-wide in 10 years. Sweden's population was about 8 million at the time. So that was much more extensively a social democratic attempt, and worked much better than the maybe looser attempt in the United States, where again, much more of a big government mentality than either today or before World War II, or especially before the Depression, but much less than in European social democracies, even today with a lot of neoliberal privatization. So, by the way, the extent here is maybe not as much as in American cities. Stockholm is a 2.5 million people region. Pink is commuter rail, but still a fair amount of extent. Quite a lot of things that were not city at the time this was built, but only really urbanized around the train. Vancouver is the same model, probably is the best example in North America. And note that I'm not talking about light rail yet. I guess Vancouver extent is not that big. So note that I'm not talking about light rail yet. Okay, yeah. So let's pause for a second. I'm gonna catch up on what people are saying in chat. So yes, exactly. Yeah. So as I said, the stuff about about race relations in Georgia is stuff that should be nuanced in many ways. One of them is that historically, yes, as you say, black middle class had a lot of aspirational consumerism about cars and about escaping the ghetto. And okay, so yeah, okay, Jake, I'm going to answer in one moment after I look at the rest, because this is a more complex answer. Okay, yeah, this is, yes, yes. Okay, Hikoki was answering most of them. Oh, yeah, so yeah, as I said, LA was the biggest city where they rejected a subway in that era, but it was not the only one. I'm not going to do San Francisco Karen, I'm sorry. Not today, at least. Yeah, so these are, essentially you're just listing all of the problems in the DC Metro by yourselves. The main thing that I might add is that they should have thought more about integration with commuter rail. But they didn't do that in any other American city at the time, so what they should have done was just thought of the commuter rail as kind of as an S-Bahn that goes northeast to southwest vaguely, or north to southwest, and then built the other lines to connect. But that mostly just means that they should have built, that this branch of the Red Line should not have built, it should have been commuter rail, they should have built something else. But yeah, no, you're essentially listing all of the problems. Also, the fact that they didn't hit Howard U or Georgetown, these were both historic mistakes. With Howard U, it was not racism. It was with the way the Green Line was being built, it was a decision, either go straight and serve Howard U or go west and serve U Street, the important commercial corridor here, and they chose U Street. And I think on hindsight this was a mistake, but based on what they were thinking, based on the thinking at the time about what the drivers of public transportation ridership were, this actually kind of made sense. And the same thing with Georgetown. Georgetown does not have access to the metro, which is why a lot of the plans to build a new tunnel here to decongest the most crowded part of the network, which is this. It's a combined orange, silver, blue. So the line goes currently like this, direct from Rosslyn to downtown DC. It doesn't pass through Georgetown. There are a lot of myths about why this happened. The real reason why this didn't happen is in the 1960s, 70s, during the planning, it was, again, not believed that universities were big drivers of ridership. This was not a purely American problem. In Romania, it's a widely mocked case was that the engineers wanted to build a metro line through with a station at the university in Bucharest, and Ceausescu's wife objected, saying that it was only important to serve factories and the students were lazy and should learn to walk. So the engineers said, I mean, they were not going to say no to Ceausescu and his wife, so they said, yes, of course, we'll not build a station. So they built the shell of the the biggest shell of a station that they could without attracting notice, so that they could fill it in later. So Ceausescu and his wife, being atypically bad dictators by already bad Eastern European communist standards, it's kind of a meme. But the belief that universities were not big generators of ridership was still common at the time. It was considered to be mostly about commuters. This is why one of the aspects that I think characterizes suburban networks is the belief that they should be predominantly about commute trips. They should look specifically for commuter destinations. Now, they understood, based on car ownership in Georgetown, was and still is very wealthy, and access to cars in downtown DC, that not a lot of people were actually going to use a station which would have been around here, around the center of Georgetown, to connect from a residence in Georgetown to work in somewhere in downtown DC, which is around here. So in the thinking of the time, there was not a lot of commuter volume that would be generated, and as a result, they didn't serve it. There's a mythology that it was skipped because of racism. People in Georgetown didn't want access by black people. That's not the reason. Again, it's because they thought they were so commuter focused, so focused on traditional commuting, that they didn't think that the university would generate a lot of trips, a lot of its own destinations. Universities were not the big eds and meds drivers that they are today. So this is mostly a story of maybe planners not noticing trends or failing to predict the future. Whether they could have is a different question. I suspect the answer is yes, they could have, but they didn't. So yeah, so these are these suburban metros of the Great Society era. Yep. Again, this was not a purely American problem. It's just that in the United States, the lack of transit-oriented development meant that the system could not be then easily retrofit for other trips. I mean, when New York built the subway, it was not considered that that universities would generate a lot of ridership. At the time, it was 1900. I mean, I believe that Jane Jacobs was born, I believe, 1919 maybe. I believe that around the time she was born, the proportion of Americans, so among her cohort, so people born in her year, again, I believe 1919? No, 1916. I believe her cohort, I forget whether it was the first one where a majority of Americans had finished high school, or the last one where a majority didn't. So about 50% of people in America born 1915 ever finished high school. In 1904, when the first subway opened, let alone when it was designed, that cohort would not be born for another decade. So universities as a big thing was not a thing at the time. I don't even remember if Columbia moved here right before or right after the subway opened. I think maybe it moved here as the subway was being planned to come here. But at the time, this was not really urban. The idea was the university should not be in like the center of the city. Now today, Columbia is the largest job center in Manhattan, north of Midtown. But at the time, it wasn't. It's just that it happened to be next to the subway, so it's now fairly accessible from the rest of the city. So I would say fairly, just because issues of crosstown travel in New York that I don't want to get into. But and I'm saying I'm not going to get into them, even though we are going to talk about the Interboro Express later. Just the Interboro Express is Queens to Brooklyn. It doesn't involve Upper Manhattan. So it just happened to be better for filling in if you just build a good basic system. If you think about this as an analogy to what you should study, or what education should a society invest in, let's say that the kind of more overall metro system, where you just try to build a system that works for everyone, but is not tailor-made for each specific group. That's like getting a good broad education. In America, it's usually considered liberal arts, but living in Germany, I think of it as studying, I don't know, math or chemistry or something like that. And then a model that's tailored to one specific group and might even drop certain types of trips because they're not currently important and then they turn to be important in the future. It's like more education is job training. So instead of studying computer science, you maybe study a specific program for video game development. And I'm mentioning this specifically just because of who I'm married to. Sid studied CS. So the point is that the suburban metro model had these problems, and so it never turned DC into another New York. It never turned San Francisco into another New York. And bear in mind, San Francisco, on the eve of Corona, if you don't count San Jose as part of the metro area, had a model split of about 17%. DC, if you don't count Baltimore, I want to say about 15%. San Francisco was definitively number 2 in the United States. I'm forgetting whether Washington was number 3 or number 4, with Chicago being number 3. But again, this produced systems that have public transit. It's just not very good public transit. New York's model split, again, pre-corona, not counting things that are not in the metro area but just in the combined metro area. New York is, I think, pre-corona 33%. Now bear in mind, I think Berlin is 33%, but on a very wide definition of the metro area, including maybe 32%, including all of Brandenburg. New York is a metro area of the tighter definition of 18 million people, or 19 million people, and the wider one, 23 million. Berlin is 6. Washington, at the tighter definition, is 5 or 6. It should not be. It should not be in the same category of ridership as a place like Marseille, as a place like Bordeaux, as a place like Strasbourg. Vancouver is, as of 2016, 20%, but this was from a census that was taken just before the Evergreen extension opened, and there was a marked increase in ridership as it opened in the following years. I'm guessing 2026 census is going to have Vancouver at 23, 24%. Even before the Broadway subway opens, so you can squeeze much more of this. So the point is that these Great Society subways, again, they got ridership in DC and in San Francisco, much less so in Atlanta. But 16 for DC, 14. Oh, okay, awesome. And knowing these numbers, these are metro areas, not combined. This is, I mean, I remember what the number for DC is with Baltimore, and it's not 16. I think it's 12. So yeah, so there was a second problem with these Great Society subways. So we so far discussed their design. We discussed how the park and ride structure led them to not have very high ridership. Bear in mind, if they hadn't done the park and rides, in 1980 they would probably have had fewer riders than they had in actual 1980. By 2000 they would have had much more ridership than they actually did. Especially now when commuter ridership is the stuff that's been hit the most by Corona, these systems would have far more ridership than they had today. But in the 1970s and 80s, maybe less, just because it takes time for transit-oriented development to develop. Let's call it the Vancouver model. It's the best that I know of in North America. Possibly the best that I know of in the Western world post-1980, and the post-1980 bit is because Stockholm is 60s and 70s. It's me slightly cherry-picking. Or let's call it the highest that I know of without either a strong social democratic state to do this, as in the case of Stockholm, or a social not democratic state, as in the case of the stronger Eastern European networks, the ones that were built in the Cold War, so Praga, Budapest, Warsaw, or conversely a corporation that, a mega corporation that kind of sees like a state, which is historically, to a large extent even today, in Japan. So this is maybe a good private example. Okay, not a bad example, but also not America. Also not like that. So the point is, so we have two problems. The first ridership that is not nothing. Again, remember, Reagan mocked Miami. Reagan didn't do the same mockery of DC. There were other people who did the mockery of DC. I forget whether it was Randall O'Toole himself, pro-car, anti-public transit rider who for many years was the resident transportation person at the Cato Institute. I think he was recently fired. Recently, as in maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, because it was too anti-transit and they wanted to take it in a different direction. But for decades, he was like he and Wendell Cox, Wendell, I'm not sure how to pronounce, who I think was turned off by the Los Angeles Blue Line, not Blue Line, yeah, by the Los Angeles Blue Line construction. Why am I still on this? Yeah, and so the point is that, and so it was these two were the main anti-transit people. I'm pretty sure they did the same mockery of DC. I don't think Reagan did, because DC has ridership. Not great ridership for how big it is, but ridership. Ditto the Bay Area. However, they had a different problem, and the problem was mounting construction costs. The construction costs, by today's standards, were not high. But the construction costs were higher than expected. All of these projects had cost overruns. Again, this is discussion from the 70s. So what we think of today as construction cost study, and I don't mean what I've been doing, which is absolute costs. For people who do not know me, this is the website with the database, which is not historically complete, which is why I'm not showing you a historic database. It's mostly for contemporary things so far. We haven't done a big update with showing all the historic things, and probably should. And but the study of cost overruns is much older than us. Oh yeah, and I'm talking about suburban metro. I gave these 3 examples, but another which was actually hooked into light rail is the D branch of the Green Line. Let's do Boston, just because it's so much easier to show it on a, I'm not going to call it a schematic, on a map that doesn't have any overlay. It'll just show you, yeah. The Green Line is subway surface. These are full subway lines, blue, orange, red. The Green Line is full subway. There's an extension that opened since 2020, so it's not depicted. The branches are numbered B through E because the A branch was closed. B, you can see it has a long section where it runs in a street median. C, the same. E, the same. And here it's even shared traffic. D was built out of a disused commuter rail branch to connect. And again, this was designed around commuters, so more parking. It was really important to connect with downtown Boston, so they specifically made sure that the D branch would never have forced transfers at Kenmore, the branch point, or anywhere else, because for these people it was the most important to get to downtown Boston. Everywhere else they would drive. So this is kind of an early suburban metro example, but with light rail vehicles, and we're going to get into light versus heavy rail. I don't think Boston was influential on that. It was more stuff that happened in the 1970s. Yeah, exactly. Vancouver needs to build the Broadway subway. Unfortunately, their construction costs doubled, and therefore the budget that should have been able to build the Broadway subway to UBC is only building it to Arbutus. Completing it to UBC is highly desirable, but because of regional politics, it needs to be paired with something for the suburbs. But anyway, so there was, as I mentioned, a slate of cost overruns. Cost overrun research, as we know, only begins in the late 80s, with Don Pickrell pointing this in the American context of the subways of the 70s and the light rail lines of the 80s. And then his database was used in conjunction with others by Ben Fluvier in the late 90s, early 2000s. So in the 70s, the cost overruns are a shock. People don't expect them. People don't have any kind of broader framework to think about them. Now, bear in mind, I think the framework people in America think about cost overruns is bad, but there's a framework. And at the time, there was no framework, so people were flailing and looking for ways to cut costs. So the idea is, instead of building subways, build light rail because it is much cheaper, because it avoids tunneling. Now, in the 1970s, light rail as we know it was invented in North America, mostly in places that did not previously have subways. Actually, I can't think of a single place that did. San Francisco, I would not count Muni Metro as part of that. Muni Metro is a subway surface line along the lines of the Boston Green Line or the Philadelphia subway surface trolley. It does not really dialogue with the light rail lines that were built. So the light rail lines were, other than in LA, they were in smaller cities. Otherwise, they probably would have, if they were larger, they would probably have built a subway on the same schedule as Washington or San Francisco. And often in the western US, just because that's where the growing cities were, and also in Canada. And often it was brought in by people who, in the Cold War, I don't remember if Canada had a peacetime draft. Like the UK, for example, got rid of conscription in 1960. The United States, because of Vietnam, kept it until the 1970s. But even thereafter, the United States was, by today's standards, incredibly militarized. Israeli military spending, not right now because of the war, but Israeli military spending as of the 6th of October of 2023, I believe was 5% of Israeli GDP, far and away the largest in the developed world. The United States under Reagan was about 7% or 8%. So the United States was, so again, much more militarized society. Many Americans who served in the military, again, often because of the draft, but even to some extent without it, who were serving in Germany in anticipation of what would happen if there were a war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So, I mean, hell, to this day, there's an extensive American military community within Germany. So they saw the invention of the Stadtbahn, not the Berlin Stadtbahn, but the Stadtbahn as it was called everywhere else in Germany. So these are people who have a very can-do mentality. Many of them are engineers. The rest respect engineers. I don't know to what extent the military in the US has this attitude today. I think much less so, and I don't know to what extent it existed in the 70s, but certainly before World War II, the highest prestige in the US was in engineers. So, for example, the highest performing West Point graduates almost all picked engineers as where they wanted to serve as officers. So again, a lot of engineering prestige. So they saw what German engineering was doing with light rail, where they were combining streetcars and subway tunnels, and then they came to the United States, and in some cases Canada, and adapted this. Not to build subway surface. Again, they didn't need Germany to tell them that. Boston and Philadelphia did this generations before Köln. But the idea of doing rapid transit, or something like rapid transit, predominantly on the surface. This involved, these Stadtbahn lines were often upgraded on the surface. What do I mean by upgraded on the surface? What I mean is that a lot of the streetcars were removed in West Germany, but the surviving ones practically always fed into a city center tunnel and often got dedicated lanes outside city center. So it's this combination of dedicated lanes, some strategic rapid transit segments, which among the early light rail lines in North America I don't think ever included this level of tunneling. Yeah, exactly. What caused this spike in cost overruns? Just cost overruns. I mean, the history of cost overruns goes back to basically the first railway. I don't remember if literally the Liverpool and Manchester had these, but the 1830s lines, the Spaten 1830s lines already tended pretty consistently to go over budget expectations, I think by an average factor of 2. So it's called, something is often called the first mania, things like the London and Birmingham. The actual railway mania is in that historiography called the second mania. So anyway, these engineers invent, and they do the good kind of invention. They import what works and they understand well enough what to do in order to adapt it to local conditions. They don't import a turnkey system. They don't do what, let's say, India is doing when it's kneecapping its high-speed rail system by tethering it to Shinkansen gauge, so they can't even run through to Indian Railway to broad gauge Indian Railway's legacy lines if they need to, and they or the width of the trains is exactly the same as the Shinkansen, rather than the 1 foot wider Indian suburban trains. So they don't do that kind of kneecapping. They adapt what needs to be done. They understand that they don't need the city center tunnels. They could do something called transit mall, and I don't know if there's a good way to depict it in Portland or Calgary and things. I'm going to do Portland transit mall and hope that I get good pics. Portland, I've never actually taken the light rail there, but I'm going to check Portland, and when that doesn't show me what I need, I'm going to check Calgary. So situation in Calgary, I actually did take the trains there. Okay, my internet is being problematic. So the situation in Calgary is that, and again, it's not American, but it's the same planning system really, and the light versus heavy rail problem is something that, not to the same extent, but to a large extent, also exists in Canada. Interesting in Canada, I think they correctly bagged the idea for the most part and are doing heavy rail. So, okay, I'm still not seeing the transit mall. Okay, so just going to describe what's going on with the Calgary transit mall. Maybe there's mapping that assists. Okay, yes, there is. So Calgary, what they did is they knew that they were going. So first of all of these cities are fast-growing Western American and Canadian cities. So the idea is to use the system to shape growth. Calgary did this better than the rest. Vancouver did it even better, but not light rail, but subway. So the idea is to build on the surface. It's okay to have grade crossings, often with control gates. Not always though. In city center, to avoid tunnels, there would be a transit mall, and again, it's not depicting very easily here. So the way it works, I think it's on 7th Street. It's a section where instead of running in streetcar mode, the trains, the street is dedicated to trains and pedestrians, but no cars, and the line runs as if it's a streetcar. Well, a streetcar with dedicated lanes, but still a streetcar in the middle of the street, and it's much slower. But it's okay because people are mostly going to downtown Calgary. Calgary is a very monocentric city. And I can't tell whether the I think the monocentricity is something that developed with the trains. And Portland, for example, never managed to adopt this monocentricity, so the system there is weaker, especially relative to its size. But it's the same kind of system. It's a bunch of lines. These are, so the south line, the first one, was right next to a freight rail corridor, so often this would be in right next to main lines, or they would be in disused rail branches. Again, they didn't import the concept of the S-Bahn, they imported the Stadtbahn. So the idea of turning them into a workable commuter railway has never really been part of North American planning, unfortunately, to the extent that there are North American systems that try to upgrade their commuter rail. It's often infrastructure first, at least electrification, frequency second, but more importantly, it's the largest system, not the smaller ones. So it's things that we're seeing glimpses of in the Bay Area, but only glimpses. We're seeing some advocacy for it, which I'm involved in, but little actual movement in Boston. More movement, thankfully, in Philadelphia, and a lot of movement, but just at excessive cost in Toronto. So the point is that the light rail is intended to escape the cost overruns of the 70s by building much cheaper, by building on the surface. So this means you build in available rights of way, and almost so. Despite the fact that it's called light rail and it's often viewed. Yes, exactly. No, they were good at what they were doing. I mean, one of these engineers, Robert Ryerson, sometimes comments on my blog and sends me things by email. He's very old. I think I don't remember if he's like a very early boomer or was born just before the baby boom. But he's one of the people who served in the military, posted in Germany, and brought ideas from there back. And they adapted to, for example, wider roads, where you absolutely could make a transit mall. Again, growing cities where you could use shape not serve as a model. They would build in rights of way that they could find, again, disused rail lines. Sometimes even in the first one over San Diego, they even had a little bit of track sharing with a freight branch. A freight branch in France, it's not like a train per week, like very little. It's nothing very extensive. It would not have been allowed if it had been. And and again, transit mall, very little civil infrastructure. Again, maybe the occasional grade separation if you absolutely need, but again, very few. You stick to the surface. You stick to rights of way. Again, it's usually not built in the median of a street except in the transit mall. It's not like the B and C branches of the Boston Green Line where they are in dedicated lanes. It's called in Bostonian, it's called a reservation, where the streets are massively wide. So this is Commonwealth Avenue, this is Beacon. Again, giant streets where two of the lanes are in the center, they're dedicated to the trains. No lane sharing with cars. Now, the trains are still very slow. They make many stops, and they also have to interface with cars when the cars turn left or when there's an intersection. But it's not the same as mixed traffic. These are not mixed traffic streetcars. The US does have a few recent mixed traffic streetcars which are entirely disasters, all of them. And so the light rail, again, would be in dedicated lanes, but usually not reservations, but rather dedicated rights of way. Often freeway medians, which turned out to not be really developable beyond parking rides, which was a big pitfall of a lot of these systems. In Calgary, it was arterial medians. So these are roads that are kind of freeways. They're grade separated, but usually they're not built to full interstate standards. Not that Canada has American-style interstate standards, but there are Canadian motorways that are much like American interstates. Toronto has a lot of them, like the 401. I don't know to what extent this is one, but for example, at the university when I was visiting for a campus interview, I went from campus to the median station. It wasn't great, but it was okay. The experience of taking the train. So I bring this up because the light rail systems, again, none of them managed to produce very high ridership. To be very clear, Calgary, I think, peaked at 16% model split. Calgary built at very low costs in the 80s and 90s, and then something in the 2000s made it lose its mind. I don't know what happened, but with the blue line, I think it's also that they had to do more tunnels and viaducts. The very thing the light rail model aims to not do is, but whatever happened, their costs. I think it's possible that the cost of this was more than the cost of all of these combined. I think it might have even not been especially close. So this way Calgary has not been able to build much anymore. And Calgary, again, is an aggressively fast-growing city because it's the center of the oil industry in Canada. Yes, of course it's going to grow. And Canada is generally a fast-growing country because they let in more people than the US or Europe. Uh, so the so Calgary is actually a really good example of how light rail, how this separation between light rail and heavy rail again made a lot of sense in the 1980s. In fact, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the one place where it didn't make sense, which is Vancouver. So Vancouver, as I mentioned, Vancouver has this the highest transit model split among all the, let's call them, new cities in North America. It's 21%. It was 20%, but that was before Evergreen opened. And I expect it's going to be 23-24% in 2 years in the census. In North America, only 3 cities are ahead of it: New York, Toronto, Montreal. Yes, Toronto and Montreal are post-war subways. I would not call them Americans. I mean, they're Toronto, you can kind of see glimpses of American influence on it, on the early subway. Montreal, no, Montreal was trying to imitate Paris. It was not at all an American-style suburban subway. And again, neither was Toronto. Toronto was designed as something that Jack Walker liked calling a grid accelerator. So very early on, so they have the bus grid, and the way they've used the subway, maybe not the way they built it, the first line in the 50s, but beyond that, is the subway essentially works as part of the grid. So the buses still run on a grid, but the point is that the buses connect regularly to the subway, and so yeah, of course the buses are closely parallel to the subway are going to be less busy than buses that are orthogonal, but it works specifically within a bus grid, something that Chicago kind of maybe wants to do, but I don't think it's actually done that. He has the idea that LA should do that, but LA needs to build the system first. Toronto actually has pretty good reach. LA, just let's not talk about LA. It is, and I'm sorry, Toronto Gaming, but LA is kind of depressing talking about public transit. Let's face it. So but anyway, Vancouver built SkyTrain around the same time that the zeitgeist was for light rail, not subways. Subways were too expensive. No new subways that I can think of were built in that time, except in North America. LA, yeah, built the Red Line in the 90s, but LA has built predominantly light rail. Vancouver built a full subway, driverless. I don't actually know, but it might be among the, let's call them regular urban transit systems as opposed to airport connectors and things like that. It might be the oldest system that's driverless. For a while it was also the longest, and then Singapore, I think, made the 2 oldest lines driverless and overtook it. By ridership, of course, way more people ride the trains in Singapore than Vancouver. But kind of Vancouver, but Vancouver kind of started the trend. And whether Vancouver is called a light rail or subway is something that is a little unclear. I would call it a rapid transit system because it is fully grade separated. But the trick is that they actually had access to good rights of way. So they had the old Pacific Electric line, which was separated from other traffic, and then they needed to do a little bit of elevated running, and then they could get to a pre-existing freight rail tunnel, a disused freight rail tunnel that they could commandeer in order to get to downtown Vancouver. So due to the presence of the tunnel, more than anything else, they were actually able to cobble together a fully grade-separated line, which then could be made driverless, without building extensive new civils. The construction costs of the Expo line were not high. The cost per rider of the Expo line was especially low. It was, I don't remember, but I think it was maybe mid 4 figures in, let's call them $2023, 2019 or 2023 ridership, whichever is higher. It's a very busy line. They did so here they managed to actually get the costs relatively under control, higher than in places that did full light rail, because they still had to retrofit the tunnel. They built some elevated lines. They built longer stations. One of the limits of light rail is often the stations are shorter. This does limit capacity. Now today you can do short stations with driverless trains that can run at extremely high frequency. Vancouver systems, I believe, capable of returning for 75 seconds. They don't do it. I think the actual minimum that they do at rush hour is 108, but even that is the best in North America. I mean, New York is capable, in theory, of every 2 minutes, in practice every 2.5. DC is struggling with every 2.5. They had to cut from that a little bit to maybe 22 trains per hour when the Silver Line was completed. The point is that so in Vancouver the trains are shorter than in, let's say, New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or Toronto, but they're longer than light rail usually. Light rail has a limitation, which is it can't be longer than a block because it can't block multiple intersections. When the train is stopped, it cannot block an intersection, so it has to fit within the block. And now, as I said, they imported a certain German idea, except in Vancouver, where they were capable at somewhat higher cost, but at massively higher benefits. So the speed in Vancouver is rather high. Bear in mind, the modern light rail systems, they have, away from the transit model, the speeds are very high as well, because, yeah, maybe there are some grade crossings, but the train has absolute priority. When you're running in the median of a freeway, it's like your grade separated. And the stop spacing, the stop spacing is rather wide, same as in suburban metro. So yeah, it makes for high speed. It's just a matter of, is there actual density there? In Vancouver, they actually managed to do it. And elsewhere in North America, they did it for reasons that have nothing to do, by the way, with light rail versus heavy rail. This is just a random fluke. That Vancouver happened to be much better at this than everyone else. This is metro. I mean, Metrotown or Edmonds, the stuff that Burnaby especially did. I mean, all of this was built after SkyTrain, based on town planning that was done while SkyTrain was, I'm forgetting whether in design or under construction, but 1980s, actually built late 80s, 90s. Very high transit model split. Because yeah, they put skyscrapers next to the train. New West, same thing. And then as they extended, they kept doing it more in Surrey. Not as well on the newer lines, so not as well in the Millennium Line. You can see some at less than Canada, same thing, the Canada Line. And so I'm already pointing out things like, they need to build some elevated lines to connect here. And the point is that over time, the light rail lines accrued more and more civils. So as I said, in Calgary, the West Line is not at all following the recipe of just keep it on the surface. There's extensive tunneling viaducts. In LA, I think from the start they had some tunneling on the Blue Line. And the upshot is that they had higher construction costs than expected because of that. This is what made Wendell Cox go so insane. This is a street segment. This is in a right-of-way. But I think there's some tunneling. Maybe this is a tunnel. This is a streetcar road. Maybe with dedicated lanes, I guess. But over time, they kept accruing more and more infrastructure. This, by the way, is a line that's kind of weird. It's considered a light rail line, but it's entirely grade separated. It's mostly in a freeway median. But at the time, the thinking was, let's build a light rail. And so because the light rail lines were not the Boston B branch or C branch, they were not streetcars but with dedicated lanes. No, they were designed for much more suburban use. So San Diego again was the first, biggest for a while was Portland before LA overtook it. Again, in Canada, Calgary and Edmonton were pretty big systems. Seattle, but Seattle is much more weighted toward a subway and also did much better TOD. Denver's a big one. Sacramento. San Jose tried, but the system was kind of laughable. Salt Lake City has a bunch. Pittsburgh. Buffalo had a line, but it's kind of sad. Minneapolis started doing okay, and then there were so many arguments over how to continue with the Southwest Connecticut that it kind of lost steam. There's St. Louis. Houston, Dallas. Dallas might actually have the longest system, but it's so extensively suburban scale. Park and rides, no real TOD, no real attempt at TOD. That for some reason they're already thinking about city center tunneling, but the ridership still sucks relative to how long the system is. Houston has the one kind of short but successful line and then weaker lines. So they built a lot of lines. Again, the cost per kilometer was generally lower than subways, but over time the system started accruing more and more civils. Wireless TOD? Honestly, judging by the politics of Vancouver as of when I lived there, which was 2010s, people started getting into anti-skyscraper ideology. I literally would see NIMBY posters in my neighborhood complaining that people who live in apartments are less likely to know their neighbors. A lot of the developmentalism is something that's easier to do in a place that's kind of new and very fast growing, because then developmentalist ideology is stronger than the anti-developmental neighborhood ideology. I think is a lot of it. For example, the Canada line, by the time that the rezoning came, was trying to maybe avoid skyscrapers, so they were talking about contextual zoning, which is a nice way of saying build less tall. Just because they didn't like skyscrapers, then Jarrett Walker convinced them that the best place to do massive upzoning would be at the southernmost margin of the line, because then people would see, because if the line has equal TOD all over, then the train fills gradually as it goes north, whereas if all the TOD is here, then the train is full all the way. Now, from the perspective of system finances, the fares are flat within the city, doesn't matter, but there's appearance of a full train, and more importantly, no skyscrapers around here where the middle class NIMBYs can see them. Good rule of thumb, if you're seeing a golf course in the middle of the fucking city, it means that the people around here are probably some kind of assholes. And this is not even Chauncey. This is Chauncey. These are the worst people in the city. To the point that when I talk to other NIMBYs in Vancouver, I talk about Chauncey. They hate Chauncey too. We bond over shared hatred of Chauncey. Again, here. We can kind of see the assholishness just by the amount of like greenery with like private lawns and everything, whereas elsewhere these are like townhouses with much smaller lawns, much closer together. These are people. Hell, the press managed to get one of the people in the neighborhood to give a quote, I think possibly with his own name, her own name, saying we are the creme de la creme, in opposition to, I don't even remember what, but that's not the point. So essentially they just surrendered to NIMBYs here. It was also easier here because there were fewer residents. A lot of the early and really good TOD examples, at least in Vancouver, were ones that were not residential before but were industrial. So here it was, this was industrial because of the train, so yeah, it was easier to rezone this residential. And again, Burnaby was different, but Burnaby was a pure suburb trying to develop a town center when it was building a metrotown and Adams. And we can kind of see the same with Surrey. With Surrey wants to kind of not be just a suburb, so it's okay with skyscrapers in specific town centers. Tall buildings cause social isolation. Just touch grass. Just please touch grass. And yes, you can live in a tall building and touch grass. Lots of grass to be touched if you live in Singapore in an HDB, for example. So anyway, bear in mind, metros remain more expensive than light rail, therefore they require more TOD to be successful. So it's remarkable that, as I mentioned, the highest model splits we're seeing in the United States outside New York City are in places that build metro, even though they built deficient TOD, especially the Bay Area. The Bay Area, what TOD? I mean, I can show you the land use near the North Berkeley train station, and then you should be able to understand why the Bay Area YIMBYs are the way they are. I mean, I might be able to find it just because it's the biggest parking lot. So the downtown Berkeley stop is around here, and I don't think it's TOD or anything, but if it was a pre-existing town center, that's fine. It's a bit. I don't remember if it's busy, if it's the busiest East Bay station, or if it's slightly behind the downtown Oakland stations. But again, good ridership. This is North Berkeley, which I can identify, as I mentioned. This is a train station. This is the land use around the train station. Okay, so despite this attention to TOD, you could even say, I think this is a gash from Cut and Cover, but I'm not sure. It's possible they specifically did this for the Cut and Cover, but BART goes here. This is BART. The fact that San Francisco managed pre-corona 16 or 17% model split in the metro area, which includes Alameda and Contra Costa counties, so this is part of that metro area, that says something. The something being that downtown San Francisco was an incredibly strong central business district, and it was getting stronger throughout the 2010s as the tech firms that couldn't find land for a campus in Silicon Valley were instead in the city. So all of the, let's call it tech bro firms, so not the ones like Google and Facebook that are older, but the ones that were founded by people who use the word disruption about 7 times per sentence. So things like Slack, Uber, Airbnb, I'm trying to remember the others. There are a lot more. Oh, Twitter. Are all downtown San Francisco / South of Market. So the tech growth in the 2010s mostly fed downtown San Francisco. Sometimes the unpredictability works in your favor, and instead of having more suburbanization than you expect, you have more reurbanization than you expect. The low interest rate firms, yeah. About being called a genocidaire, I'm Jewish, so I mean, development of the North Berkeley station, another step of approval. 768 units expected at North Berkeley. Okay, that's a start. Now let's look at the let's look at the site again and its size, just because I don't have a good intuition for this. So interior of the block is on the order of 3 hectares. What is 3 hectares in Berlin? Again, in Berlin, in Berlin, so the Euro block tends to be about floor area ratio 3-ish, because it's you build on slightly less than half of the lot, and you build usually 7 stories residential here. Of course, made of concrete, because wood is for Finns and peasants. I don't actually think that Germany looks down on Finns that much, but the other people so named. So what's a good place to look at for recent development? There's a lot of it here, I just never remember, and a lot of these buildings are commercial. Like this building that's under construction. Okay, this is an older thing because this building is basically complete. This is predominantly commercial. But if you're doing predominantly resi, it's like, I don't know, here, yeah, you're building on like half the law. Yeah, so this is, how many apartments were there? And again, this is a mostly commercial building, so I need to do a little bit of extrapolation because probably something like, assume that every building like this is about 20 units. So 20, there's no building here, but there should be. So 20, 20, 20. This is 20, and these are commercial, so imagine this is 20, 20, 20, 20, 20. We're talking on the order of probably about 200 units-ish on a pure residential in this lot. And this is 1/10. Yeah. 768 units is not that impressive. Sorry. So anyway, with light rail, you don't need as much DOT to be successful. And yet, the problem is it was built in smaller cities, I guess, maybe, so the model split never improved. Portland, kind of infamously, some of the transit opponents in the United States know better than transit proponents, unfortunately. Portland, I think, has about the same model split as of in the 2010s, so pre-corona, as it did before the light rail opened. It failed to increase model split, all it did is stem the decline. It's 6%, metro area. Seattle's about 10%, Seattle did better. And yeah, Portland did some TOD, just not enough. And then, let's talk about the more modern light rail lines. So I'm talking about systems that mostly developed in the late 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s. And over time, the standards for light rail increased. There would still be transit malls because it's kind of been codified, but everything else, there would be expectation of full grade separation. This meant more viaducts. It also meant more tunnels. Sometimes even city center would get a tunnel. In LA, for example, so this is a light rail line that's, again, functionally heavy rail. It's just, it runs light rail vehicles. It's the only light thing about it. The cost is just the cost of building an elevated freeway median system. The exact cost of this, I mean, you can find cost of this, but these costs are not going to matter because this was the last new freeway built in LA. There have been widenings since, not many, but some. But this is the last new freeway built in LA. By that time, there were a lot of anti-developmental interests, and I'm going to call them anti-developmental and not environmental or pro-transit, because these are also interest groups that are not building trains, or at least not trains that people ride. So when they built this freeway, the Century Freeway, the 105, they had to face massive lawsuits that required an extensive list of mitigations and just neighborhood level surplus extraction, one of which was as a SOP to actual environmentalists, including a light rail line in its median. So yeah, you can try to figure out the cost of that, but fundamentally it was built as a mitigation for a freeway. The freeway should never have been built, let's face it. The light rail line kind of shouldn't have been built either. It's, what exactly is it serving? So downtown LA is here. Now, the biggest non-downtown job centers are west, things like Westwood, Century City, Santa Monica. There are some north, like downtown Burbank, Glendale, a handful in the valley, like the rich but with actual jobs part of the valley is Ventura, as opposed to the rich but like extremely wealthy residential. The only job there is if you're going to like a producer's audition, a producer's home to personally audition for them. And that's around here, like Mulholland Drive. Some industrial jobs all over here, but they don't cluster very much, so they don't generate a lot of transit ridership. What else? Again, more industrial. There's El Segundo. El Segundo is actually a pretty big thing, but the Green Line kind of serves it, but it's not the best. There's LAX, but kind of LAX, El Segundo, Um, Torrance, Long Beach, maybe San Pedro with some, and then Santa Monica. Like all of that calls for like an orbital north-south line that does something like this, and that's not really been built. There are plans to build the line of Sepulveda, but it's plans. Um, may happen any decade now. May. So this line doesn't really connect much. It kind of wants to connect LAX with the Norwalk commuter train station. This is where the Green Line ends. This is where the Norwalk commuter station is. They have not actually connected them. It goes almost, but not quite. And this is it's not like it's a place where like maybe it's a central business district or a secondary business district where the commuter rail station at one end and the light rail at another. This, like, I mean, look at the land user. Just look. And of course, lots and lots and lots and lots of parking. Yeah, no. And the LAX end, it doesn't connect either because it like tries to go to El Segundo. Except, why would people take a train to El Segundo if they live here? Like El Segundo needs connections, like region-wide connections, and this does not really provide them. So they built a line that honestly should never have been built. The money should have been going elsewhere. But it's called light rail because they use light rail vehicles for it and was part of the light rail construction system, and it doesn't go in a subway unlike the red/purple line. So red, purple, currently being extended, should have opened 100 years ago, but 100 years later is yeah, I want to look down on them because of my opinions on the Nordic countries, but I mean, not always. I know some really cool fans. Some of them are even like from Finland rather than immigrants. Oh god, yeah. Yep. I don't know. But the point is, over time, light rail lines, I don't know if this was what started it, but over the 90s and 2000s, light rail lines started occurring more, I don't know what to call this, feature creep maybe? Or maybe civil infrastructure creep is better, where instead of being just streetcars but with dedicated lanes and judicious use of new rights of way were available, they became subways running light rail vehicles. So again, I said I don't want to talk about LA, and I kind of have to talk about LA. Some of the extensions in LA are essentially that. For example, Crenshaw is light rail, but quite a lot of it is underground. And because I don't want, and because this is probably the most reliable place for me to find numbers, I'm going to look there and then find that I forgot to put it in. But this is our database. This is a public link. For people in chat, so that you don't need to furiously copy paste or click. Okay, we do have Crenshaw. Okay, great. So Crenshaw is 34% underground. So let's not call it a subway, but there's extensive subway construction there. Not many else, I guess. And the construction costs, again, they're not high, not by American standards. And let me check this because this might be old. So, LA Crenshaw light rail line construction cost. Because I would disbelieve a number from 2000 and... Oh, the real cost. Oh, it's actually on budget. Okay, so let me do this right now. Because we would like to, because I would like to showcase that the reference is that the cost actually held, which is actually really interesting because there was a lot of inflation through 2022. So, and these are all nominal dollars. Is it open already? I don't think it is. Or is it? Oh, it did open. Okay. Let's check that I got the real year. Nope, 2022. Yeah, so again, these are not high construction costs for an American subway, but the line is only 1/3 in subway. So, um, and the thing is, at the same time that this happened, heavy rail lines stopped doing a lot of tunneling. No rush. We're going to talk about IBX? Yeah, of course. Usually I talk for 2 hours, or a little more than 2 hours even. It's been an hour and a half. Opinions about the Nordic countries. I lived in Sweden 2 years, and after those 2 years, when I started giving every country a derogatory nickname, so for example, Israel is of course occupationiya. Sweden got the nickname hypocritia. Now this is something that's more specifically Swedish, but it's affected the other Nordics. So, and in Sweden was neutral in like the European geopolitical theater, which extended into the world wars, as were other countries, but Sweden and Switzerland, uniquely within Europe, actually kept their neutrality in World War II. And this kind of neutrality led them to try to do things, so they were attractive places to do diplomacy and also espionage. And this diplomacy involved a lot of work to try to reduce the extent of warfare, and that turned into good human rights advocacy. Neither country, actually no, Switzerland has a lot to apologize for in the Holocaust. Sweden genuinely does not. Sweden took in Jewish refugees in the Holocaust. Exercised a lot of diplomatic pressure as a neutral country, not on Nazi Germany, it would not have worked, but on allies of Nazi Germany, especially Hungary, to get them not to exterminate the Jews. So again, good human rights record. Unambiguously good. And then comes the Cold War, and again, Sweden stays neutral, and keeps thinking in human rights terms, but keeps thinking of human rights far from its border. So in the war, it was close to its border, but the hotspots it was thinking of were far from its borders, essentially because it didn't want to take sides in the Cold War. And if it was going to talk about human rights, I mean, what was it going to say? Yes, there's some dictatorship in Greece, but let's now spend the rest of eternity talking about Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and of course the Soviet Union. Like, they didn't want to take sides, so they went to places where genuinely both sides of the Cold War were a bunch of mass murdering thugs. So Sweden did a lot of really good work on peacekeeping in decolonizing parts of Africa, for example. But this kind of led it to an ideology of caring about caring about human rights in direct proportion to their distance from Sweden. So they give out a lot of foreign aid. But domestically they don't give a shit. There's a lot of domestic racism that they pretend does not exist. Switzerland has similar problems, by the way. I once saw a collection of equal resume studies of racial discrimination, where the US was pretty middle of the pack. Germany was on the good side, but this was discrimination by name. Germany, being a European country, mostly discriminates against Muslim women through hijab discrimination, anti-hijab discrimination. Britain was average, maybe slightly better than average. Sweden and German-speaking Switzerland were the worst. Again, it's like it's this mentality that the sort of human rights people who in the US would be fighting for civil rights within the US, or in Germany, kind of same, or in Britain, kind of same. In Sweden, they're horrifically white saviors. It's much worse than British white saviorism. So again, this is something very specific to Sweden, but it's kind of affected human rights advocacy in the other Nordics. Raoul Wallenberg did really good things. Again, Sweden, like the Swedish mentality of human rights does lead to good things. For example, very high, they take very high numbers of refugees from poor countries. I think in the 2010s they were consistently the number one in the developed world per capita. Maybe Germany overtook them in the late 2010s per capita. But again, horrific levels of discrimination, much more normalization of the extreme right in Sweden than in, for example, Germany. constant hate crimes, like refugee absorption centers in Sweden magically catch fire all the time. And again, it's not a direct corollary of accepting a lot of immigrants, because Germany does that, and CDU, for all of its racism, has certain limits, and open collaboration with the extreme right is one of these limits. Creditworthy. So anyway, again, this is something specific to a specific cultural dislike that of the Nordic countries. But anyway, back to this. So light rail lines in the United States. So the Expo line, for example, has had extensive viaducts. I don't remember whether it had. In theory, I can check, but do I have the LA Expo line here? Probably not. Okay. The Expo line in LA, we'll look for it and add it. I think it's mostly elevated. But other than this section, very little streetcar mode running, to the point that a short section, instead of being the kind of compromise of the old lines in Calgary and Portland, some clever way to reduce construction costs on an otherwise already cheap system because they go in mostly undeveloped corridors. Instead, it reduces costs, but by much less, and it seriously compromises capacity, especially with these two lines not just sharing this line, but also this being, as I remember, at grade. Not a good place to do a junction at all, especially with the ridership of these lines. Meanwhile, it's often the case that heavy rail lines, when they're extended further into the suburbs, are themselves not in tunnel. In DC, for example, and also BART, their outward extensions are not entirely underground. In DC, the Silver Line was mostly built in the median of a freeway. There was a little bit of deviation to serve Tyson's corner here, but for the most part, it just runs in the center of this freeway, and now the construction cost relative to how little tunneling there is was rather high. Again, it's a recent American line. Of course, it's expensive. And meanwhile, Portland did the same thing with the light rail line, the Milwaukee Max, which again, it's an at-grade line that cost much more than it should have. I think its color is orange. I call it Milwaukee. I often call the lines by the names that I remember for them during construction because I was looking at costs. So things like Crossrail, not Elizabeth Line, and likewise Milwaukee Max rather than Orange Line, but I believe the correct name is Orange Line at this point. Or the Evergreen Line, rather than just at this point the eastern part of the Millennium Line. So the actual construction, civil infrastructure is at this point really similar. There's extensive but not 100% tunneling. In city center, there will be much more tunneling, often 100%. I think Pittsburgh had such a line. Places that have transit malls sometimes are even thinking of putting it underground for more capacity. I think I've seen this proposed for Portland and Dallas. I've craned that for LA. I don't know if it's actually been seriously proposed for LA. So at this point, and again, this is a post-2000 thing, light and heavy rail have been, in terms of infrastructure in the United States, very similar. Again, in the 1980s it was very different. In the 1980s, there's heavy rail, so things like expansion of the New York City subway, which did exist at the time. They built the I think that's when they opened the 63rd Street Tunnel. Moving the Orange Line in Boston, doing some extensions on the Red Line in Boston, so to Braintree, which is just suburban metro. They even overrode some of the right of way of the. So in the same way that this was kind of an OG suburban metro, except light rail, this too. The Red Line used to only do this, go up until here, and then this section was the light rail line. That this being heavy rail, instead of running through, still has a force transfer. There are only two, and because it's an old streetcar route, the idea was that you should just not have grade crossings. There are only two grade crossings there. So in theory, they could extend. I mean, there are grade crossings in the Chicago L. This is a branch that they added, I believe, 1980. And by I believe, I mean this is literally a historic map, which means they can check it at 5-year scale. Yeah, so 70s. I think this opened 1980. And then they moved, and then the red line used to terminate at Harvard, and then around this era, they moved it. They moved the terminal a little bit in order to extend it to Alewife. There were plans to extend it farther into the suburbs as a further suburban metro into Arlington. At the time, Arlington was full of NIMBYs and rejected the plan because they didn't want poor people, often and black people from the city, to have access. Again, this was the Arlington of 40 years ago. At this point, Arlington is for people who can't afford Cambridge. So people in Arlington at this point want there to be a subway, but the construction costs have exploded so much that they can't do it anymore. Maybe I'm not sure they could have done it in the 1980s either. American costs at the time were lower than today, but they were still really high. So bear in mind that this was not tunnel, but this was. So this is tunnel, Cambridge to Alewife, or rather Harvard to Alewife. Alewife is within Cambridge, although on its margin. Then there's light rail, which is at grade. This is the 1980s, but over time these converge. And at this point, it doesn't really matter. It's just, are you buying things that are sold as subway trains or as light rail vehicles, where the light rail vehicles are unlikely to be running at grade. So not a very big difference. I actually looked at the costs of this in the United States. I don't have the database in front of me, but I've actually looked at the database that is not 100% complete, but is close to it. And yeah, I mean, for the more recent projects, so like last 20, 25, maybe even 30 years, except maybe parts that are 0% in tunnel, because then it's full elevated versus full at grade, the costs are the same. The costs are the same. It's just a matter of how much tunneling you do. So it doesn't really matter if you build heavy or light rail with how they're conceived in North America today. Hell, Toronto, which kept arguing over light versus heavy rail, with each change leading to a worse project at higher cost. The plan ended up doing kind of worse of both worlds, because the concept where light rail is just a streetcar with a reservation is kind of foreign at this point. We have it here, but it's not. But it rarely comes from new construction. To some extent, it does in France, but often. But that's mostly for smaller cities. Now, of course, Paris is a giant tramway network, but it's a circumferential system for the suburbs. In the city, tramway line 3. So in Paris, there's still very strong separation. If you wanted to tunnel in Paris, you build métro or RER. France can actually build. The United States cannot. Germany, like France, can build. Germany, unlike France, is incredibly anti-developmental. I mean, France is anti-developmental in different ways, but France likes building infrastructure, and Germany doesn't. So this is the tramway line within the city. It's T3. It doesn't run the entire circuit. And it doesn't run as a continuous line. It runs as two lines, 3A and 3B. They split here at Sion. Well, on Sion and Porte Vincennes. And they run around the boulevards of the Marshals, which are very wide. The way that the city used to work was that this was military fortification. The boulevards of the Marshals were the inner end of that, and what is now the Périph' was the outer end of that. So actually a lot of development here is high density because it's public housing like HLMs. But there was dense urbanization historically right up until this point. So at the intersection of the metro with the Boulevard de Marchaux, there's a station always. So this is actually a really good place for a light rail line. Again, high density, generally on both sides, because of the development sense. So, but so yeah, this goes into reservation, and this removed space from cars. But first of all, Paris has a typically high willingness to do that, to remove space from cars. Berlin, for example, kind of doesn't. Look at who it elected as mayor. And second, again, a typically wide boulevard. So in Paris, again, so in Paris, there's a strict separation. In Germany, there's strict separation because the historic streetcar networks are historic, and yeah, they're being re-extended, but it's all systems with the bones of a historic system that's being upgraded with dedicated lanes. These are not light rail lines that are designed to be kind of a lighter system of a subway. That would be Stadtbahn, whereas the streetcars have a different name. It's called Straßenbahn. But in the United States, the evolution of light rail, since from its origins in Stadtbahn, have made it over time converge with heavy rail in costs, which are again very high, unaffordable in the United States, and the ridership has been disappointing for the same reason as a lot of heavy rail systems, just insufficient transit-oriented development and penny-wise cost-cutting through placing significant stretches of route in freeway medians, and preference for park and rides as well, which are difficult to redevelop. Not difficult from a technical standpoint. They're actually it's a large piece of land you can redevelop, but then you're creating a large interest group of transit riders who use the park and ride and will throw rocks at you if you suggest reducing parking. Yeah, exactly. So with then there are other proposals for undergrounding. This is even in San Jose. In San Jose's light rail, I think among the major cities in the United States that have light rail, it has the absolute lowest ridership per kilometer built. I think they have the distinction of being the only city that closed down a modern light rail section rather than just a historic streetcar, because one of the sections was so weak. And yet, light versus heavy rail is a really important distinction for federal bureaucrats. Why? Because in the 1970s and 80s, the idea of I think the idea was 80% of the benefits for 20% of the costs, was believed to be light rail. So this was a big thing that was required to be studied in various alternatives analyses, environmental impact statements, environmental impact reports, where you would need to study several modes, and every time a new mode is accrued when activists demand to look at it. So now you have to evaluate heavy rail, which often means subway, but could also mean commuter rail. Usually they're treated separately. So heavy rail, which means subway, commuter rail, light rail, BRT. And owing to that history in the 1980s of model warfare, and then subsequently in the 90s and 2000s with bus rapid transit, this is treated as the most important thing to study in environmental impact statements. Again, alternatives analyses, major investment studies, because of the idea that these are different modes, which can only be compared within mode, and then maybe you can compare all light rail lines with all heavy rail lines as kind of a broad thing. So essentially you're comparing maybe the New York City subway, or the latest, something like BART or old sections of the Washington Metro from the 1970s with old light rail lines from the 1970s, and you don't notice that things built in the 2010s or even the 2000s in between the two modes are exactly the same. So the bureaucracy hasn't adjusted. Now, the bureaucracy could adjust. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, I don't know. But it's something the bureaucracy should be adjusting to. And now talking about IBX. Now, IBX in New York has a right-of-way, has a fully assembled right-of-way, where you can literally see the gash. And I've talked about IBX specifically on stream, so you can see, but I'm going to talk about it again. You can see the gash. This is a mainline rail right-of-way. South of this point, roughly, so this is south of this, of the Lower Montauk line, south of this point, this is owned, I'm forgetting by what appendage of a public agency, there is freight, but something like 2 trains per day in each direction, so basically nothing. Old plans from the 90s were to kick out the freight and put subway tracks in here. There's enough space along the entire line for 2 tracks. Most of it also has space for 4, not all of it. Here, the magic asterisk this. The idea was maybe to move the freight to the intercity corridor. So the Hellgate Bridge has room for 4 tracks. It used to have 4, it currently has 3, but they could restore the 4th. 2 passenger, historically 2, now 1 freight. The idea at the time was to, maybe in the 90s, was to move the freight corridor to Amtrak. That's before the freight rail owners realized that they could make a bonanza out of making impossible demands of passenger rail operators that wanted to share right of way and then go away for money. Again, surplus extraction, same thing that NIMBYs do. And except these are NIMBYs that are like very large corporations, and that you can't do eminent domain on, because in American law only the federal government is allowed to do eminent domain on railroads, not state governments. Given how mutually abusive the relationship between rail and states and localities has been in the United States, I don't even think that's a terrible rule. Has problems, but the alternative would also have trouble. Would also have problems. But anyway, so this section is owned by CSX. This section is again owned publicly. They're not kicking out the freight, partly because of the idea that it would unleash a torrent of trucks onto city streets, again, 2 freight trains in each direction. Mostly it's copium, because there are people who dream about building a freight tunnel from here to here, and abandoning this for freight is an admission that this tunnel will never be built. The tunnel will never be built, but and there's no impetus for getting money for this tunnel. But the tunnel, but again, lots and lots and lots of just pure copium on this. They're just pure deadendism. So they're planning to do a light rail, but with viaducts wherever the right of way is too narrow, so like double deck it. Except that it's trench. So you need to build a very tall viaduct, because you're not going to have grade crossings, you're going to go above the road. Then around here, there's this tunnel through the cemetery that they need to build, that they don't want to, because they think it's going to be too expensive. They're not going to disturb any of the graves, they're going to need to move the mausoleum here. So they have this idea that they need to zigzag in streetcar mode, like this, and then go back to the right of way. There's so much NIMBYism here that they probably can't build a reservation, so there might go next traffic. But the point is that they keep looking at this as a model question, like light versus heavy rail or whatever, and as opposed to things like, okay, whatever mode's going to be, like, it's going to be rapid transit predominantly. It doesn't matter if it's light rail vehicles or subway. Probably New York should be doing subway, because there's literally not a single light rail vehicle running in New York, or rather in east of the Hudson, New York. Jersey has some, but no real way to get them to New York. So for economies of scale, build the mode that you already have. There are already plausible connections between this line and the subway. To it here, they run next to each other. But instead they fixate on model questions, because that is required by federal regulation to look at different modes, to make sure they studied all options. So this means studying the option of light rail versus heavy rail versus BRT. So now they're talking about why light rail and not the others, and they're making things up like that they need to zigzag here. They don't need to zigzag again. It's begin tunnel here, end tunnel here. 100 something meters. With this it's 160 meters. You may be able to tell that this trench has quite a lot of space, so 2 freight tracks to urban rail tracks, that's fine. So they don't need to tunnel all of this. And even if they did, so what? It's cut and cover, it's cheap. So I'm slagging on them on this, but mostly I'm not slagging just on that, although again MTA capital planning is incompetent. Some of it is modulated by the fact that by FTA standards, by federal standards, they need to study the different modes, just because the distinction between light and heavy rail was really significant 40 years ago, even though it no longer is, and not ask other questions, things like stop spacing, things like frequency, things like how it's going to interface with the bus system, because if this is built and suddenly it's going to change bus demand, because there's probably going to be a lot less bus demand on other crosstown corridors. Again, the subway in New York mostly gets you to and from lower and midtown Manhattan, and it's not very good for crosstown things. It's supposed to change that. And so it's going to maybe change demand in certain buses, or how it's what they're going to do with bus connections. Size of stations is really important. Size of trains, I think, is more important as an infrastructure question than light versus heavy rail. Are they going to only go as far as Jackson Heights is currently planned, or are they going to go into the Bronx? They keep saying they can't, because two Amtrak tracks that are about to get a bunch of commute trains as well with Penn Station access, one freight track. I get why this is difficult. It's possible to go over. A journalist recently asked me this, and my response was, it is possible to do so, but all options are painful. So you can share trains with freight, can share tracks with either mainline passenger rail or with urban rail, but that makes maintenance much more complicated, because the freight trains would have to go at night, and that also impacts the rest of the car. You can't have one short segment where the freight trains go at night and the rest they go in the day. I mean, then everything has to be kind of nighttime operations. And also it means you don't have maintenance windows. Or you can have urban rail share tracks with Amtrak and commuter rail. It's possible, but it means the reliability will be not very good. So again, possible but difficult. I understand why they made the decision, but they needed to spell it out, and instead they spelled out some bullshit about light versus heavy rail, because that was what is considered important by regulations that are looking at the world of 30, 40, 45 years ago. Again, even more questions about where to go beyond this. I mean, I can think of 4 different ends to this line. So from Bay Ridge, you can go either only up until here, where passenger ownership ends, and then find a way to connect to Middle Village, to the subway. You can go into Queens, as is planned. You can go into the Bronx and then do what the RPA proposes and just run on the northeast corridor to get to Co-op City. So radial circumferential, don't do that. Or fourth option, which was the third regional plan, the idea from the 90s, which was to use some disused tunnels like this. Some of these tunnels no longer exist. I think they gave away parts of the right ground here. So a little bit of greenfield tunneling to eventually reach Yankee Stadium. And instead of studying the alignment, they studied the bullshit question of light versus heavy rail, because that's regulatorily what's considered important. Okay, I'm gonna take some questions. I'm already having to. Is a decked over trench properly considered a tunnel? No, because they're not gonna. The decking is not going to seal the trench, as I understand it. The decking is going to leave a lot of space, so it's not going to be a tunnel for purposes like fire evacuation, smoke control, and so on. Because there's it really is going to be only a partially covered trench. And Jake, is it just you, or is the U.S. allergic to orbital lines? I don't think it's an Americanism, honestly. I mean, LA kind of has one with a green line. They're planning the Sepulveda light rail. The United States just has much less urban rail in each city, so they just have the circumferential. So they just have the radials. Whereas you're talking about systems that are much larger, like in Berlin, it's Berlin's not that large city, but Berlin has a vast rail network. Paris, same. So Paris has multiple rings, by which I mean lines 2 and 6, T3, and soon to open Metro 15. London has the Circle Line and the cobbled together ring comprising multiple overground lines. Askfa has line 5, has the Circle Line, but also the Great Circle and the commuter line. Does the vehicle choice affect sharing the freight? No. It doesn't. The problem is not FRA regulations. The problem is that if you share tracks with freight, so first of all, subway trains aren't different from light rail on this. Second, commuter trains could share tracks, but at the end of the day, that's still aligned with 2 freight trains a day that are going to muck the passenger rail service whenever they run. So you either say they're only going to run at 11:30 at night when passenger trains only run every 15 minutes. You don't want to run them overnight because overnight you want to shut the line for maintenance. Or they're just going to create long gaps in service. So yes, they could do it. It requires, I mean, it can be scheduled around, but at the end of the day, all of this is an admission that this will never be an important freight line. This is only aligned with a handful of freight trains per day that can be run circa midnight. And as a result, also the people who demand millions of dollars for studies of this tunnel, because it's not like they're actually going to build it, so it's tens of millions of money, not billions, which is what the tunnel is projected to cost, should touch grass. Maybe not touch grass. Touch grass means they're drawn line. They should move on. Yeah, it's not about freight. Remember, the light versus heavy rail in this context is things that are not commuter rail. And even the things that are, in the case of IBX specifically, they're not. It's more about recognizing that this is not and will never be an important freight artery. Are there more questions? If it's a 2-hour recording, then we have 3 more minutes. And because this is frozen, I can't tell the lag is, so I can't tell, but I'm gonna do one last call for questions, and what is the problem? Or is my internet just not? No, my internet is working. Just this is. Oh, is there much potential benefit for conversion of low capacity to higher capacity? No. Or let me amend that. No, except maybe in LA, because the issue is not, the capacity issue is entirely length of train. Now, if you're Portland, the hell do you need long trains? I mean, there might be something about minimum headway, but I don't think the difference is that significant unless you're doing like very good driverless metro operations, and I don't think any place in the US, it's not New York, has any business doing that for capacity. Yeah, if you're trying to reduce your long-term costs, sure, but that's not gonna, but you don't care about capacity. Or you shouldn't at least. That's not the problem. The problem in a city like Portland is not capacity. Again, LA could be doing that with, could be having that problem in the future. With its size and its capacity constraining shared section here. Especially with now that they have the regional connector, which I forgot to mention. So streetcar mode, but then streetcar mode turns into a tunnel to connect to the gold line, to the old gold line. So now the lines go shrip and shrip, and yeah, this is a shared section. So yeah, this you might want to do just because these are lines that really need dedicated pathways through city center eventually, but normally it's just a matter of things like low versus high floor, and there are German Stadtbahn systems that have some lines that are this and some lines that are that in the row. Like maybe one of each or one and two, I don't remember, in places like maybe Essen or Düsseldorf or Dortmund. So again, it's a distinction that does exist, and you can just run a system with an X, that's fine. Again, the train length is not going to be the problem. The minimum headways, I mean, I think the Calgary Light Rail manages to squeeze train every 2.5 minutes at rush hour in the transit mall. Okay, ooh, another good question. Why is London doing much better than New York post-corona? It's not just the Elizabeth line. The Elizabeth line helped, but subtracted, and that's still true. There's just been much more work from home in the United States and in Europe, and much less return to the office. We can maybe talk about it in terms of lower quality of public transport makes people less willing to do the commute or something, but it boils down to, it's something that just boils down to straight out more work from home. And of course, some industries have more of it than others, which is why San Francisco got hit much worse than other American cities. People don't move to San Francisco for consumption amenities, like the weather, okay, whatever. They move for work. And the work in San Francisco is disproportionately work that became remote. And this is completely independent of the tech layoffs, which are also a thing, but the tech layoffs are also in car-oriented places. Are there other questions? Yeah, because this is frozen, I can't tell what the lag is. I'm gonna give it 1 minute and then... Actually, I mean, I know what the lag is because I know how fast you said things. I'm gonna do one last call for questions and then I'm gonna stop. And while we're at it, doing Alon Eats cookies on stream. This stream is not sponsored by, but I'm rather happy to be eating that, especially now that they started selling it in the Shreddy across the street from me. Oreos. Alright. Thanks for watching, let's end this. Thank you all for watching. I will see you once again in either 4 days or a week with a new topic, TBD. Maybe we'll do the topic that lost about the environmental backlash in Europe. Maybe we'll do something else if there's much more demand, the way there was much more demand for this. Frankly, way more people for this than showed up to stream, so. Thank you all, and I will see you soon, and ciao ciao.